So the San Jose Sharks are a team that, in my opinion, is kind of just stuck in limbo. They're definitely not a contender. They're not a playoff team, but they're not really in contention for a lottery pick either. They're just kind of meh, and they could kind of go in either direction. It would certainly be easier for them to just tank and put themselves in the lottery conversation for the 2023 draft. But they are good enough that with a couple of moves, maybe potentially they could put themselves back into the playoffs next year. I don't think um, they can turn themselves into serious contenders within a year, but maybe they can get that second wild card spot, maybe even a first wild card spot, and at least get into the first round, I guess. It's not really an option that I think is ideal for most Sharks fans at this point. I think we would rather see the team just tank and get some really bona fide, or at least one bona fide, like really, really good prospect. I think a lot of Sharks fans are expecting William Eklund to be that next guy, and I do think he'll be pretty good, but I'm not convinced that he'll be like a superstar uh, guy at the NHL level. So let's see. We've got the Sharks cap friendly page open, of course. Big shout out to cap friendly. They're like one of the best websites that exists. And the Sharks currently have a little over $5.5 million in cap space for next season, and they have 13 forwards signed, including Kevin Lebank, who is technically on IR, and 8 defensemen, including Nikolai Knizhov, who is also on IR, and then 2 goalies with James Reimer and Aiden Hill. So they have 0 UFAs that are coming up uh, after, or coming up right now, I should say. They do technically have a few with Ryan Dzingel, Jaden Halbegovacs, and Alex Stalek, but I don't think any of those guys will be back, and they're not difference makers anyways. So not really anywhere where they have to make a big decision. They do have a lot of RFAs, however, not many of them are really big difference makers. I don't think they have Chmelevski, Jonathan Dahlin, Jonah Gadjevich, Noah Gregor, John Leonard, Mario Ferraro, Nicholas Malash, and Capo Kakinen. So of those guys, the biggest ones, or at least the guys that are going to get the biggest contracts, I believe, will be Kakinen, unless they trade him, because they do have 3 goalies. Ferraro and probably Noah Gregor, maybe Dahlin, but I don't know. It's hard to say with Dahlin because he had kind of a weird season. But yeah, so with the way things stand, they don't have to make any big decisions if they don't want to. And what I mean by that is just there aren't really any big name free agents that they have to sign. No UFAs. Their biggest RFA name is probably Mario Ferraro, and I mean Ferraro is a pretty solid defenseman. I love Ferraro. He's a great energy guy, but he's not really, he's not a big offensive guy, so he's not going to put up a crazy amount of points or be a huge difference maker on the ice most of the time. And he's not exactly a shutdown guy either. He's just kind of a grinder who can give you good minutes. So, I mean, I don't know. He'll probably get like 3 by 3 million or something like that. Kakinen, I don't think they're going to trade him given that they just acquired him halfway through this last season. So they're probably going to trade Hill or Reimer, was my guess, and Kakinen will be in the rotation or in the tandem, I should say, for next season. And it's really hard to say what type of contract they're going to give him because he didn't play a ton of games for the Sharks last season. So they're going to have to go off of his work with the Wild. And I know it was kind of up and down with the Wild. So I wouldn't be surprised if he got like a 1 year deal perhaps like a 2-year deal for with a relatively low AAV. So again, not a huge deal there. He is arbitration eligible, which is interesting. So hopefully it doesn't come to that. Then Noah Gregor, I think he'll probably get 2 to 3 years, somewhere between 1 and 2 million, probably closer to 2 million a year, unless he gets more term. Like if he signs a 3-year deal, I think it would be closer to 1.5 million. But if he gets a 1 year, like $2 million deal, I think that's perfectly fine. He had a pretty solid season, in my opinion, even though a lot of Sharks fans weren't very happy with his production, but it definitely ticked up towards the end of the season well, and he showed good chemistry with guys like Chmelevski, Bordeleau, and Balsers as well. So he definitely earned a raise, and he's definitely staying on the team. I know there's a lot of people that want to see him traded or like buried in the minors or something, but that's not going to happen. He's a valuable player, but again, not a huge uh, cost when it comes to the cap. Dolan, I don't know. I think he's gonna get another 1 year deal as well, just because he kind of still has to prove it. He produced at a good enough level to show that he could have some value in the NHL, but man, uh, he's not very strong on the puck, and he just really got worn down as the season went along. He started off all right and really fell off hard towards the end of the season. I mean, really early, like the first month of the season or so, I would say he was kind of in the Calder conversation. He was at least like a dark horse, maybe like a fifth or sixth, maybe seventh place guy in terms of rookies. But by the end of the season, like nobody was talking about him at all. Maybe like 22nd best rookie. So yeah, it's kind of hard to say what type of contract he's going to get. Again, because the Sharks tend to overpay their players by a little bit, in my opinion, on average. I mean, guys like Erik Karlsson, you could say are overpaid by a lot. Brent Burns, you could say is overpaid. Vlasic is overpaid by a lot. I mean, these are their big guys, right? So, uh, Don obviously hasn't earned that. So it will be interesting to see what happens with him. Now, the Sharks could potentially have a big decision if they want to. There have been rumors, not so much lately, but there were some little, I don't know, inklings of rumors, I guess you could say, going around closer towards the end of the season, the end of the regular season, where they were talking about potentially trading Brent Burns or maybe even Erik Karlsson. And that's probably the most interesting part of the Sharks offseason, whether or not one of these guys gets moved. Because if they want to go back for the playoffs, I think trading one of these guys isn't necessarily a bad idea. Having them both hasn't really worked out, I don't think, because having them together on the top power play unit definitely hasn't worked. Having them on separate power play units, one guy is always kind of getting underutilized because they're both should really be manning top power play units. And I think the Sharks power play units in general have suffered from this like almost lack of identity in terms of who their uh, power play quarterback is or their like number one guy is. So if they do trade one of these guys, I suspect it will be Brent Burns, just because his contract, in my opinion, is a bit more tradable. It's still not great, but after, well, this season is already over, so he has 3 years left on his deal at $8 million a year, which isn't terrible for a team looking for a number one power play quarterback. He still gives you good minutes. He can still put up points, and he can still run a number one power play. Burns' defense is still questionable. It has been for most of his career, but any team that's looking to acquire him knows that that's the case. And you're not really acquiring a guy like Brent Burns for defense. Anyways, you're getting him for the points production, the power play production. So if they do trade one of these guys, that'll be interesting to see what direction they're going in. Because again, it could kind of go either way. If they're rebuilding, it would make sense to trade these guys. But if you trade him in a deal that let's say you just really free up the cap space and then you go out there and you use that cap space to sign another big free agent or trade for another guy with a larger cap hit. Maybe they acquire a guy like Alex DeBrincat, or I've heard rumors about Pasternak being available. So if they get a guy like that, they beef up their forward core, which kind of desperately needs help if we're being honest. Then they're maybe looking more like a playoff team. You give the top power play unit to Carlson, like for sure, 100%. That's his unit all season, assuming he can stay healthy. And then suddenly you have a role for Ryan Merkley. He is the bona fide second power play unit guy. You can learn from Eric Carlson, get a full season of development in, and see how he does. Defensemen do tend to take longer than forwards to develop and start to really come into their own at the NHL level. So I think a lot of Sharks fans have been kind of harsh on Merkley so far, but he's only 21, guys. He does have a lot of room to grow, and I don't think he's ever going to be in the conversation for like top three, top five offensive guys. I mean, he's not a Kale McCarr, he's not Adam Fox or Miro Heiskanen, really. But he could be a pretty decent power play quarterback who gives you maybe 40 points a season, and there's nothing wrong with that. Perhaps the area where the Sharks do have the biggest decision ahead of them is in goal. They currently have three goalies on the roster. I mean, Kakinen hasn't got a contract yet, but he's an RFA, so he will get one. And then what do they do there? They're most likely going to trade one of these guys. I seriously doubt it'll be Kakinen, given that they just acquired him, and he did play pretty well for the Sharks, in my opinion. So you got him, and then it'll be one of Aiden Hill or James Reimer. So I think it makes the most sense to trade Reimer. He is on a good cap hit. He's a veteran. He's an older guy, so he's not going to be in the league that much longer. You send him to a team that potentially has a chance to actually win a cup. That would be good for James, obviously. And now in goal, you're very young by goaltending standards with Kakinen and Hill, who are 25 and 26 respectively. But if you want to go in the kind of rebuilding direction, then that makes sense. However, Kakinen and Hill, I think, are still good enough to give you competitive goaltending if you do want to make a playoff push. In that case, I do think Kakinen would be the starter based off of Hill's performance last season. But also, Hill was injured for a large part of last season, and that has kind of been part of his shtick. He has had injury problems in the past when he was with Arizona. So I don't know. Do they have a third goalie they can rely on? No. Um, their non-roster goalies right now are Strauss Mann, who is it says his status is minor. That's interesting. I thought that he was committed to um, University of Denver again for next year. I'll have to come back to that. Zachary Amon, who has not really developed well, but he was a sixth round pick and he's still pretty young, so we'll see. And then Zach Salchenko. Salchenko actually did perform quite well when he was called up. Very limited uh, ice time. I believe he started like only 3 games, maybe 4. He did get 1 win, and he had several relief appearances where he was just fine in all of them, really. So he would probably be your third goaltender in the case of trading Reimer. And I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, If the team, again, if they're going in a rebuilding direction, I think that's great. You have three young goaltenders. You give him a chance at some point. Somebody gets hurt, he gets a chance. See what you got. You never know. If you want to be competitive, you don't want him as your third goalie. When it comes to trade targets for the Sharks, it is really kind of hard to break that down until we see some moves that they make because they only have a little over $5.5 million in cap space, and they do have these RFAs that they have to sign. So they don't really have any cap space to go out there and trade for players unless they are trading out cap as well. And of those guys, I mean, Vlasic is not tradable. Burns is is tradable, like I mentioned earlier. Carlson maybe, but I doubt he's going to want to get traded. In terms of their forwards, I don't really think any of them are tradable except for, oh, and I hate to say this pains me to say this so much as a Sharks fan, but their most tradable forward is who has the most value is easily Timo Meyer. And what they do with him, I think, will be another indicator of which direction the team is going. If they want to rebuild, maybe you trade him. If you want to go for a playoffs, you definitely do not trade him. So that'll be interesting to see what they do there. His cap hit is only 6 million for this season, so that doesn't give you a ton of cap space if you do trade him. But he is an RFA after this season, and he's going to get a substantial raise. At this rate, I mean, if he plays this season like he did last season, he should be the highest paid forward on the team. He should easily make north of 9 million, I would think, or at least 9 million. So at that point, I mean, we're getting into two off seasons from now where they have a lot more uncertainty, so it's kind of hard to say what their cap situation would look like. But given how much cap they have tied up in their top three defensemen and their top two forwards already, it is kind of hard to see how they're going to be able to afford Timo. So that that alone could probably be a topic for a video. But man, I really do not want to see Timo in another sweater. I kind of wish that they had traded Hurdle because that is the most realistic option for them to be able to afford Meyer, or at least it was. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. So I don't know. You know, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Who knows? Maybe the cap will go up by like 5 million next offseason. I doubt it, but it is, I guess, technically a possibility. A couple wild cards for the Sharks to me are Kevin Lebank. He is technically on IR right now, but he should be good to go for the beginning of the season. And before he got hurt, he was just having an abysmal season. And if he keeps producing like that, like he's way overpaid. Doug Wilson famously said that he is a 65 point player. And if we just look up Kevin LeBank's uh, hockey reference page really quick, you will see that Kevin LeBanc has never put up 65 points in a season. The highest rate he has ever produced at was 56 points in 18-19, and that was a team that 18-19 Sharks team, they just scored goals. They probably way overperformed. That was LeBank's highest shooting percentage in any season he has had in his career. So that was probably a bit of an outlier. It seems like he's more of an 8 to 9% shooting type of guy rather than 13%. And he was also playing on a third line with Joe Thornton. That probably has something to do with why he shot so high that season. So, man, I don't know. Uh, he's a guy that I don't really think has much trade value right now, and his cap or his salary cap is not great either. In fact, does the IR count towards their projected cap hit? I think it does because he's not on LTIR. So so yeah, that's not an issue now, but certainly if they could trade that contract, that would be good. At this point, it would be a salary dump unless he performs well in the first half of the season and then they trade him at the deadline. Maybe then you could get assets for him. But either way, it will be really interesting to see what happens with Lebank. Uh, Other wild cards, Shimek a little bit. He has not really performed too well in the last couple of seasons, but his cap hit is definitely movable, and he is a serviceable NHL defenseman. He can be physical, he can give you solid bottom pair minutes. So maybe they can get away with trading him without really having to give up any assets. Maybe they give up like a sixth or something for a team to take his contract. Or maybe they even get an asset. Maybe they get like a seventh for him. I don't know. They got a seventh round pick for Dylan Gambrell last year, and that is not something I would have guessed they would have been able to do. So you never know, especially, well, I was gonna say especially with Doug Wilson at the helm, but he is not at the helm anymore. It is Doug Wilson Jr. for the time being, but do they they are going to be hiring a new GM at some point here, hopefully before the draft. So whoever the new GM is going to be will likely kind of dictate the direction the team goes in unless ownership is telling all their GM candidates this is this is the direction we're going to go in. If you're okay with that, great. If not, we're going to hire somebody else. That could be something that ownership would do. I don't know, but yeah, it'll be an interesting off season for the Sharks, I would say. One that could be extremely mundane. Uh, their draft is probably going to be pretty mundane, I would say. They do tend to trade down a lot, but I don't know. Let's see, they're drafting 11th overall. So maybe if they foresee a guy they like falling more than that, they trade down. They don't have a second, so they could potentially trade down and pick up a second round pick. But it's just a really weird draft in general. And the Sharks are a team that is good at drafting, and they have found a lot of guys in the later rounds in the last few years that have really progressed very well. And Doug Wilson Jr. is still the head of scouting, so I have very little worries about what their draft is going to be like. It's just going to be interesting to see if they make any moves around the draft. Last season, there were rumors about them trying to make a deal with the Devils. Wow, a deal with the Devils. That's a good phrase. There were also rumors about them wanting to trade up into the second round last year, which I can't remember if they actually did that or not. I don't think they did. I know they didn't have their own second round pick last year either. At least I'm pretty sure they didn't. And yeah, they have three sevenths because why not? Um, yeah, I as a Sharks fan, I'm not that thrilled about the draft. They'll probably get Korchinski at 11. That seems to be who they're targeting. And when it comes to free agents and trades, it's really hard to say. It could easily be a very mundane offseason, and that's, to be honest, that's kind of what I'm expecting. If they trade Burns, that will be very interesting. That'll probably be good for me. Brent Burns trade video could definitely get a lot of views. Um, but yeah, that will be it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you did like it, please do give it a like. Uh, if you thought it deserved a like anyways, that would be greatly appreciated. And yeah, have a nice day.